Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome back to the Red Spectre podcast, or webcast, I suppose.
Today we're talking about part 2 of Karl Marx's The Communist Manifesto.
All right, so do you want to kind of get us started here?
Yeah, so part 2 basically talks about some of the goals of communism. Marx kind of tries to define what communism is and kind of differentiate it from some of the other political and philosophical theories out there. And then he covers some of the objections to communism, and finally he talks about how communists can go about achieving their goals. Basically, we have to start with understanding what communism is.
Yeah.
Um,
That's when the government does anything, right?
Right. Yeah. If you ask Republicans, yeah, sure. That's basically what it is. But not if you ask Marx. By the way, this wasn't just written by Marx. I just realized that I keep saying Marx's manifesto. It was Marx and Engels that wrote this.
Yeah.
Just to be completely clear here. Anyways, Marx wanted to differentiate communism from the other political movements of the time. He says that communism is different because it doesn't try to manipulate the proletariat or the working class, and it doesn't try to use them for its own purposes. The whole point of communism is being representative of the proletariat.
Yeah.
There's no other goal.
That's very different than, like, the Republican Party, where they pretend to give a shit about abortions just so they can get votes, so that they can make rich people richer.
Exactly.
Or the Democratic Party, where they pretend to care about a black person on the Supreme Court so that they can make rich people richer.
Exactly, right. Yeah, there's no making anybody richer here. It's just the working class interests. Communist theory, Marx says, is also different from other philosophies because it's based on how capitalism actually works in the real world. So Marx understood that human behavior doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It's the result of the material conditions that people experience. So instead of I've got a cat here. Okay. So instead of using some abstract idea to come up with how people should act to then come up with an economic system, Marx basically uses the reality that he sees, the reality of class conflicts and the reality of how capitalism is actually working, in order to extrapolate from that to create a better economic system.
That's probably a good thing to contrast with the sort of justifications they use for capitalism, where, like, at the same time you have, well, people are completely logical, moral creatures that will do what's in their best interest and the best interest of everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And this works because they're insanely selfish and everything they want will only benefit them ever. And, like, none of the actual justifications make any sense as a whole. They just say whatever they need to prop up that little piece.
Yeah.
And then move on. Like, you know, Supreme Court case justification from Scalia.
Right, yeah. So basically, a lot of the philosophers in Marxist day and before basically were just people that sat down and, like, thought really hard about things and then came up with ideas based on what they thought.
And to be fair, that's what everybody did up to this point about anything having to do with human nature, because, like, psychology and sociology didn't really exist yet.
Yeah.
But instead of trying to do that, he just tried to look at, like, the direct results of, you know, if you have this economic theory, what is the outcome of that? What is the necessary result of these actions, rather than trying to guess about how humans will eventually interact with it.
Yeah, so Marx basically tries really hard to root all of this in actual real life things that are happening. So in that way, his economic theories are very scientific. which is good because you can, test scientific hypotheses, which
Yeah.
we can do over time. Anyways, so looking at the material conditions of the world as Marx set them out in the first part of the Communist Manifesto, he says that it becomes clear that bourgeois property is the ultimate source of exploitation and class conflict. And because of that, Marx says that the ultimate goal of communism is the abolition of private property. And right away, that might sound problematic to a lot of people.
Yeah,
So
that's like the biggest complaint that people have if you bring up socialism or communism.
Yeah.
It's removal of property.
So Marx goes straight into addressing some of these concerns, and the first one that he addresses is, and I'm going to quote him, we communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of man's own labor. Property which is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property.
And it's important to understand that there's a difference between what he's talking about with property and belongings or possessions. So property is the funds that you would use to run a business. It's large amounts of stock that you can trade in as collateral to get a loan. It's owning a building where you can have people come and work, but it's not like your car or your TV. Those things aren't part of what he refers to in this. So if we're going to talk about that, we're going to try to use like possessions or
belongings.
Yeah, or belongings or something like that just to differentiate. But that's probably a confusing term on purpose in response to these kinds of ideas, because if you as a society, as the people moving society, can conflate owning a house with owning an Xbox, then you can't really make a good argument against one without making people think that you're criticizing the other.
Marx says that a capitalist property is not purely personal property, or as we call it, or as we're going to call it, personal belongings. It's actually social property and social power. And by that he means that when a capitalist owns private property, so like if they own a company or a corporation, that gives them the power to get other people to work for them, and then by doing so create more capital for them.
So it's the power of exploitation.
Yeah, it gives them the power of exploitation, exactly. So, but then when that capital is converted into common property for all the working class people, and by this we mean like they get paid and then they get money, and using that money they buy personal belongings, such as, furniture, TV, or books, that personal property does not have any social power anymore. So that's just your own stuff. You can't use it to exploit anybody else.
And I think that's something that a lot of people have trouble wrapping their heads around, because I saw an argument just earlier today that was two people where one person was arguing that, money should be done away with, and the other person was like, well, I think capitalism can work and we can fix it and it can be non-exploitative. And then both people talked and they agreed that universal basic income was ideal. And they got to the point of like everybody would be paid by the government, and then this other guy was still like, okay, but like if you want to do more, then you should still be able to have a business and charge people and make profit off of other people's labor. And like, people aren't paying for things at that point. And the idea that you should just have this inherent right to own a business and get other people to work for you while you do nothing, that you are entitled to this kind of thing, is part of the common fantasy in America, where everybody believes that someday they're going to be wealthy. So it's a problem that people do this, but it can be done fairly and justifiably as long as I'm involved, sort of thoughts. And the ideal of this is you take all of these things, like you have the private property of a business and you distribute it to equal ownership across all of the employees. And at that point, there is no exploitation. Everybody gets an equal share of the profits on this. And even without doing this at the nation level, at a small standard level where everybody gets a vote on what happens, everybody gets a vote on who you sell to, prices, all of these things you get a say in, then it's no longer a power over the workers, but a power of the workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And this obviously can work because we have co-ops that exist right now, and generally co-ops are very desirable to work in because people actually get a say in what happens in their work environment and with their company as a whole. But anyway, once Marx makes this distinction between private property and personal belongings, he points out that, you know, the people who work for the bourgeoisie don't actually acquire any private property from their labor. Instead, all that happens is that through their work, they just increase the capital of the bourgeoisie, which can then only continue to increase by finding more and more wage labor.
Yeah, and this is something that goes up pretty readily in laborer class sort of jobs. And you could say that this breaks down if you're like upper middle class. You know, people who live in San Francisco and do like programming don't have trouble acquiring property. They make huge amounts of money. But like my friend Jacob is the assistant manager at a Walmart, and his dream is to someday be able to make a down payment on his house, but he has a disabled daughter. And if he tries to save money to make a down payment, then they cut off his social security assistance for his autistic daughter, and then he has to spend all of his savings before they start helping him with that again.
Mm-hmm.
There's no possibility of ever having savings or ever moving up or ever acquiring the kinds of things that allow people to change their lives, even when you get to basically the low-level management positions in these kinds of labor jobs.
Yeah. So basically, all that many workers can do is just sustain themselves instead of acquiring private property.
Yeah.
And that's the differentiation for Marx. He says, and I'm going to quote here: "We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the products of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only in so far as the interest of the ruling class requires it."
And that's something that you see a lot with like the pushback for minimum wage increases and things, where people go, well, I mean, you can get Medicare or Medicaid and you can get food stamps, so we don't need to pay you, and there's no reason to do that. And basically their argument is people don't deserve more. And as we're seeing the government subsidies and the increase in unemployment, people are straight up complaining that people are making too much now. Like, it's dangerous that somebody who's used to minimum wage should suddenly have enough money that they can pay down their car loan.
Yeah.
So,
like, maybe the problem is actually that they weren't making that much before.
yeah, so it's absolutely been kept just purely at how can we get you to survive so that you will show up and you will do your job and you will make us money and nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why there's all of the like feel good stories about like KFC buying somebody a car because they've been walking to work for like 10 miles a day for the last 3 years.
Like, maybe pay them a livable wage instead.
Yeah, pay them enough that they can afford a car.
Yeah.
And it's not an issue, but it's way cheaper to give away $100,000 a year in like lottery sort of things to employees and make us all be like, oh great, than it is to actually pay livable wages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's only the exploitation of other people, the property that allows exploitation of other people that Marx is saying that we need to get rid of. And that kind of gets down to another common misconception of communism today, which is that it would be just like this really meager, bare bones existence, and that nobody, like, we would all be in bread lines, and everybody would be on rations and all of this.
Yeah, and like we literally are having bread lines right now
Yeah,
in this country.
exactly.
They're just
Exactly.
miles long in people with SUVs.
Yeah, but even besides that point, Marx points out that in bourgeois society, workers only exist to create capital for the bourgeoisie. They exist to accumulate a profit for them. Whereas in a communist society, that labor that went into making a profit will instead go to enrich and promote the well-being and existence of the workers, because the workers are going to be the point.
I think it's worth kind of touching on that again, going back to like the breadline thing. Anytime somebody mentions socialism or communism, everybody like immediately there's that guy that's just like, yes, Venezuela. And the breadlines in Venezuela aren't because that's the only place to get food. It's because that's the place where you get the government subsidized food, and everybody has an allocation for that, and there's a limited number of those places. If you live in Cuba, you basically get a food stamp card, and you go to the government store and you get that amount of food as a guarantee for part of being alive, but you can go to other stores and buy food. So like that's not the only option, and the illusion of this problem and the weights that are created on it are because people are queuing in line for something that they are being given as part of being a citizen, and that's a demand. It's not because there's a limitation on the food in general necessarily. Now, Venezuela's not a great example because they're fucked by all sorts of problems right now, but like it's not a problem that's inherent in it. When you see these things and they're a constant thing that keeps turning up in communist societies, it's because they're being given food for free, and people are queuing up for that before they go spend money on food someplace else.
Yeah, and I mean, could you imagine if the huge amount of just like capital that exists today, and the huge amount of resources that go towards like admin, and I mean that's important, but just
But like
all the excess that only exists to make some people richer.
Well, even like in social services, like the degree of extra administration required for turning people
for
down.
billing, for like things like that. If all of those resources were instead put towards just making people's lives better.
Well, and even if you ignore like the administrative costs and the labor costs of all of that shit, like just distribution.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that's floating around right now is the mountains of potatoes that are being dumped in Idaho to rot because there's not enough distribution and there's not enough actual need, because people aren't going to fast food places as much anymore. There's not this giant need for potatoes for French fries. The fields are all producing them. They're dumped. They're dead. And once they're in a mountain outside, you can't eat them anymore because the sunlight makes them poisonous. But like in a functional society where these kinds of things are put towards public good, when we have a situation where people are out of work and people are worried about hunger, the government should be stepping in and taking all of these things and giving everybody 40 pounds of potatoes instead of letting them rot in a mountain in Idaho.
Right, yeah.
Not like an earth mountain, just like the potatoes are themselves a mountain.
Yeah. Yeah, so the myth of people not really ever having enough in a communist society is really just a myth, because if anything, things would run more efficiently and more geared towards the welfare of people instead of the welfare of capital.
And one of the things that people don't bring up a whole lot because of the Cold War and like trying to vilify the Soviet Union, even with all the problems that the Soviet Union had, rent was like 5% of your income.
Mm-hmm.
Like you would pay for it, but if you compare that to now, where somebody maybe makes $1,400 a month take home income, but their rent is $900 because they live in a city,
Yeah.
it's a very different thing. And while sure the Soviets didn't have access to Coca-Cola, they had 95% of their income to spend on stuff. Like another 5 to
I
10%
mean,
of
they
it was
only
utilities.
didn't have access to Coca-Cola because we didn't want to
Yeah,
give
we
them
refused
any.
to do it. But like at the end of the day, they had 70 to 80% of their income as just disposable income.
Mm-hmm.
They could use it for activities. They could use it to buy art supplies, anything that people want to use money for was available. Whereas now, most people who are working something like minimum wage, buying something like an art book or like a nice brush and some paints is considered like a really big treat for a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly. So once Marx differentiates between private property and personal belongings, and he says, look, we don't want to get rid of personal belongings, he goes on to address the whole doing away with private property thing specifically. And I'm going to quote him here. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property. Precisely so, that is just what we intend. So basically, he's saying, look, you're accusing us of wanting to level the playing field, and yeah, guilty. That's what we want to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And if the goal is doing away with hoarding of things, like landlords have to go, you shouldn't have 36 units that you rent out. You should have where you live.
Exactly.
And apartment buildings, the tenants just own where they live, and houses, you just own where you live, but you don't get to own more than one.
Yeah. Or I mean, like, even in Cuba, what is it? They can own their regular home, and then they can own a second vacation home.
Yeah, you can have a beach house or something.
So
if you want.
it's not like you don't have to be like unreasonable here, but the whole point is you can't hoard wealth. You can't hoard houses. You can't hoard companies. You have to level the playing field.
Yeah. If you have $80 billion of profit that could go to one person over the course of 14 years, Bezos, maybe you can give that to your employees.
Yeah, right, exactly. So he goes on to say that, people accuse communists of wanting to take away people's individuality. He says, people say that the abolition of property means that people will no longer have their individuality.
Yeah, your individuality as a person depends entirely on whether you get flaming hot Cheetos or the normal kind, and it depends on what color your brick house in the suburbs is, and exactly how much land you own.
Right. But, like, what does this accusation even amount to? Like, we've just determined that the vast majority of people do not actually have private property.
But you see, that's why it's okay to say that they have to go back to work in a pandemic, because they're not individuals, and they have no actual status that means anything, and therefore we don't need to think about them.
I mean, like, that's kind of exactly the point, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the logical conclusion of this sort of assumption that what you own is who you are.
Yeah,
if you own more, you're more of a person.
Yeah, individuality basically comes down to being a bourgeois property owner, and yeah, that kind of individuality should be made impossible because it relies on exploiting others. Going on, Marx says that, I'm going to quote here again, it has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease, and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long ago to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness, for those of its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. So, I mean, that's like, it's so true. All of these, CEOs of multi-billion dollar corporations, they don't really do shit. I mean, yeah, they probably have meetings,
But
meetings all
like,
day.
I'm not sure that they even do that. But the crazy thing is that people have gone in and actually looked at all of these CEOs that make, hundreds of millions of dollars, and there's not even any correlation between like company success and their income. So, uh, HP brought in a new CEO, and then they bought out Palm, and they sold this outrageously expensive tablet that, even though it was like 10 years ago, the thing is still usable today. It's like equivalent specs of what you go buy at Walmart.
Mm-hmm.
It's this $700 tablet computer. And they spent billions of dollars on this whole process. And then they swapped the CEO out, threw the entire project away, just ate the money, and then that CEO got a huge bonus for wasting $40 billion on nothing.
Yeah, exactly. So the people who have all the property don't really do any work, and the people that do all the work don't have any property. And I think besides that, it also kind of gets into a misconception about what motivates people to work and like where work ethic comes from, because people don't want to just sit around and do nothing for the most part. Most people
Yeah.
want to be busy, most people want to feel productive. Now, most people probably do not want to work the hours that they work, and that's fine because they don't actually need to be working the hours that they work. Worker productivity has gone up so much that we don't actually need to be working 5 hour weeks, 40 hour weeks.
Yeah, 5 day weeks.
Yeah, five
Yeah.
day weeks, 40 hour weeks. We don't need to be working that much,
Yeah,
and the only
we
reason
should have like 3 days, 6 hour
exactly.
days.
And I think the vast majority of people would be completely fine with that because people want to feel like they're contributing. They want to feel like they're doing something.
Yeah, and one of the big complaints that you see is, well, if you did away with this kind of thing, how are you going to incentivize people to do the jobs that nobody else wants to do? If they're not in complete financial, just dire need, then who's going to clean up the public restroom? And well, I guess every time we go to the public restroom, we're just going to have to clean the spot that we're in. Like, oh no. Clean up after yourself.
I actually saw a really interesting discussion on Reddit about this a while ago, and they were talking about this whole notion of specialized labor and how it doesn't actually need to exist. Like, you don't need specialized training to be a janitor. You don't need to be a janitor all your life. So
Yeah.
maybe, like, have people working in shifts. Have somebody work, however long as a janitor, and then have them switch to something else that's maybe slightly more desirable.
And that's what I mean. Like, if you're going to have something like a public restroom, then, like, part of the agreement should be that the way that is funded is we take turns taking care of it. If we're going to use it, then rather than rubbing our own feces on the wall and graffitiing it, we should be expected to treat it responsibly. And if somebody pisses on the seat, they should bother to wipe it off.
Yeah, exactly. And like the main takeaway is that everything about how our work life right now is structured is in order to benefit a capitalist society. It doesn't need to be like this. We don't need to make somebody work as a janitor their whole life, because we can figure out how to make it better if we're looking out for the good of people instead of the good of corporations.
Yeah, which is a very foreign idea in
Mm-hmm.
the United States.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, so another objection that Marx addresses is that, people say that if the bourgeoisie disappears, so too will culture. All that fine bourgeoisie culture,
And this is
fancy operas.
This is something that you see a lot currently, where, jazz was shit on forever until it was appropriated by white people, and rock and roll was shit on forever until it was appropriated by white people, and hip hop was shit on forever until fucking Eminem, because apparently, like, rapping about murdering your wife and her mother and throwing her in the trunk of your car is just way better than like shooting the police and doing drugs. Like,
Right, yeah. I mean, it is kind of funny, I'll admit, but
but it's not culture until rich white people have it.
yeah,
It's just
so
America.
yeah, so Marx responds to this by saying that the disappearance of class culture is not the same thing as disappearance of all culture, and that the culture which would disappear is actually the very culture that for most people is actually just conditioning to live as a machine in the current system, which I think is really overlooked a lot. Like, how much of our culture is just training for us to accept the capitalist system and
Yeah, I mean,
to live like cogs in the machine.
a lot of it.
Exactly.
Our media, again, going back to music, oops, going back to music, it glorifies excess.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to have excess, you have to have somebody that's dirt poor, and that's, you know, one of the big central themes, you know, started from the bottom, now we're here. And the reality is, started from the bottom, now the whole crew's still at the bottom, including me.
Right, yeah, and you know, I jokingly made fun of opera as being bourgeois culture earlier, but like there's nothing inherent about opera that makes it bourgeois. Like anybody can enjoy opera if that's what they enjoy. That kind of thing wouldn't necessarily disappear.
Yeah, I mean, part of what makes it bourgeois culture right now is you have to have somebody that's you have to have a society where there's enough disposable income to pay for somebody to be a specialized singer.
Exactly.
In that regard, where you're doing live performances. But in a society where everybody is like treated fairly and people are able to just pursue the arts because housing and food and things like that are taken care of, then yeah, like it doesn't hurt anybody for you to dedicate your life to learning how to sing opera, and you don't have to be a rich fuck to even pursue it.
Right. I would say, if anything, culture would be much more free to flourish under a communist society because there wouldn't be any of these artificial restrictions because you have to fight for your own survival first.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that you hear a lot from like ridiculous claims is like, well, the reason we shouldn't do abortions is because what if you kill the next Einstein or Mozart? Well, how many Einsteins or Mozarts have gone through their entire lives just like flipping fucking burgers because they can't afford to change anything because there's a lot in life and they've never done anything. They had a shitty education, they had malnutrition, they were stunted immediately, and their entire lives are just there so that we can treat them like shit while we're out buying a hamburger.
Right, exactly.
Just the loss of
individuality.
Yeah, the loss of creativity, the loss of progress that will have happened because of this structure is just enormous.
Yeah, the next objection that Marx talks about is that communists are accused of wanting to abolish the family, of wanting to destroy sacred family relations, and of replacing the parental education of children with social education of children.
Good.
Right? I mean, first we should clarify that at the time Marx was writing, public schooling didn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, people threw a giant fucking fit about public schooling.
Right, yeah.
And they still do, because fucking Betsy DeVos is still trying to kill the public school system and replace it with vouchers.
Yeah. But more than that, we have to realize how much of the historical basis of the modern family is just rooted in exploitation and private gain.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that like you and your spouse are supposed to live by yourself in an apartment with your kids comes out from the idea that landlords need to make more money.
Yeah.
So you can't live with your parents because then there's nobody buying houses.
And like even the very idea of marriage itself, it's so that a woman is attached to a man so that they know that her children are his.
Yeah, and
in all likelihood.
Historically, I think in a lot of places poor people didn't even like officially get married. They would just like claim they were married and like hold a little personal ritual, and that was it. But
Yeah.
there was no recognition of the state because they didn't own anything.
And of course, the only reason you need to know who the children belong to is so that you know who to give your inheritance to.
Yeah.
It all revolves around property. And the Marx points out that the type of traditional family that bourgeois society conceived of at his time doesn't really even exist outside of bourgeois society, which is what you were referring to, like the whole the wife being the stay-at-home mother. And of course, this is from Marx's time. Things have obviously changed a bit, but that didn't exist among the working class. Everybody worked. The children fucking went to work in factories.
Yeah.
The type of traditional family unit just didn't exist for anybody except for rich people.
And when people talk about preserving traditional families now as part of this claim, uh, the way that we view this kind of stuff is like dating from like the 30s forward. It's not humanity. It's just like when they decided that the American dream is to own a house in the suburbs, they had to create all of this other garbage to go along with it. And now that's the garbage that everybody just has to stick to. There's no possibility of moving past it.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out that for the vast majority of human history, most people, like you mentioned earlier, lived in family groups. And I believe that there have been a number of studies that have actually shown that people's psychological well-being goes up when they live in groups, when they're in close contact with a lot of people, because we're social animals down at the very bottom of it.
Now that's why everybody's losing their minds, because they're not allowed to go get a haircut, because the hairstylist is their therapist, because that's just we talk and we seek people out.
Yeah. And because we used to do much more group living, that made other aspects of life a lot more tolerable. Like, people would have constant help with raising their children. It wouldn't just be up to the mom and the dad to raise their children. It would be the mom and the dad and whatever other family they lived with, and probably the entire street, or and going back further, not really streets, but
Yeah, like
it was a very
community.
communal
Yeah.
thing. And that eases so much of the burden from just the two parents. And you see this so much in modern society. You have two parents that are both working full-time jobs, and they have kids, and they have to try to find time to take care of the kids. And they either have to find a babysitter, or pay somebody to take care of them, send them to preschool, something, to daycare, or they have to try to see if their family can do it. But a lot of times their family is working, people are having a harder time retiring, so maybe their parents are still working, and so they're stuck with this. Really, it's a burden. Kids are a burden. I'm not saying that they're not great for people who want them, but they're difficult. And so you're stuck with this kid that you have to try to take care of by yourself.
And then when you fail that, you are vilified, and the child is frequently taken away. And they use that kind of thing then as an excuse to justify not giving you a support network afterwards. So, okay, maybe you had some sort of government assistance as a single mother for the fact that you have 3 kids and you're trying to make ends meet. Well, now, protective services had to get involved because you had a job and the kids were home alone, and well, now you don't qualify for this and this assistance anymore, making the problem worse.
Mm-hmm.
And like when you see things like poor people that end up with drug addictions and things where the kids aren't eating, like it's terrible, but it's kind of understandable because you're stuck in a situation where there's no way out of it and people just seek to escape.
Yeah.
And it's preventable if we had simple things like a right to childcare.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, basically the whole system as it is now is just set up to alienate us. We're alienated from the other people who could be helping us. We're alienated from even our families because we don't really live in close proximity anymore. And the more alienated we are, the more vulnerable we are to exploitation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so next Marx talks about the objection that communism would introduce a community of women. And here he means that basically women would be a situation in which women are shared communally among men.
They're not property. Oh no. Also, there's nothing wrong with sex work.
No, yeah, obviously not. And some of this is a little bit anachronistic, I think, because he's writing in fucking 1847. But he does have a pretty good view here. I'm going to quote him directly. The bourgeois sees his wife as a mere instrument of production. He hears that the instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to the women. He has not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production.
I think that's interesting because, like, first, the whole women aren't people thing that's common in society with, like, even, like, the presidential candidate Biden being like, I don't think a woman should have the right for the sole say of what happens to her body.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like, there's the whole immediate slippery slope garbage involved in it. If gay people can get married, what's to stop me from marrying a goat? If I'm not allowed to have a house, I can't own a woman, and I'm gonna have to share.
Right? Like, maybe don't view other people as property. And
yeah, and like, all of that goes back to, like, the stigma of, like, slut-shaming and all of this other stuff. It's all something that we're having to struggle to get past all the time because the conception of women being property and being there to have babies for the purpose of either furthering your family hierarchy,
mm-hmm.
so somebody can get your stuff and it doesn't pass to the government, or so that you can produce more little workers to make people rich. Like, if this is the sole purpose, then it makes sense that we keep having traditionalists trying to defend, you know, regular family status and stay-at-home women and shit.
Yeah, and I really do like that, writing in 1847, Marx was able to be like, hey, maybe we shouldn't just view women as instruments of production, which, that's cool. And I've kind of found, going off on a little side note, I've kind of found that looking at a bunch of, communist thinkers and leaders, there is this, like, thread of being more, what we would call progressive nowadays. Like, hey, these are all people, let's treat them as such. And
well, like, even if you're somebody historically, again, this is mid-1800s, if you happen to be somebody that believes that a given race is inferior, but you also strongly believe that it is not okay to exploit anybody, then, like, even if you don't like those people, you're still going to believe that they shouldn't be exploited and they should be treated equally. And that's a major move forward from, like, other stances at the time, where regardless of what your personal mindset is and the cultural mindset, it kind of fixes a lot of these problems just because you have to start from the assumption that people aren't there for you to use. Mm-hmm. They're there because they're there. They're there for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, like we listened to a podcast about Thomas Sankara the other day, and they talked about how he, made a huge push to get women into the working place if that's where they wanted to go, and that was a big thing at the time.
Making sure they had real jobs.
Yeah.
That it wasn't just like janitorial or like weaving cloth, but like real important positions in government and managerial positions in the military, doing exactly the same stuff that men were doing exactly. regularly.
So, like, over and over again with communist thinkers and leaders, you see this, like, thread of egalitarianism, because the whole ideology is just people are what matter, and that's really cool.
And that's not to say that it always stays. So, like,
yeah.
in Soviet Russia, Lenin basically pushed for equality for everybody, where women and men were treated equally, the races were treated equally. Homosexuality, in his opinion, like, he didn't think it was great, but he said it should be accepted because nobody has a right to judge that kind of thing. And it was decriminalized for many years until he died and people decided to do more conservative baseline stuff for purposes that were their own ends. But it's something that it's really hard to find a whole lot of quote-unquote conservative ideas that hang around. You know, people like to claim that Shea was a homophobe because in his travels, in his book about finding himself and finding the philosophy he wanted to live by, he said something critical of a gay man and then like never said it again for the rest of his life. And that's like the first half of the book.
For more on Che Guevara, by the way, highly recommend the Bad Empanada episode on him, or multiple episodes. He might have several.
Oh, he's got a lot of little like short ones making fun of the idea that T-shirt man is bad. But yeah, he does a lot of really good in-depth stuff on that, and it's well researched, it's well referenced, and it's worth the time. It's kind of long, but it's worth the time.
I don't think we have the right to say anything about being long.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. We're just babbling for hours, so that's fine.
Yeah. So, going on about the whole community of women thing, Marx points out that, you know, there basically already is one, and there has been throughout history because prostitution exists. And beyond even prostitution, he points out that, you know, the bourgeoisie can basically already sleep with any proletarian woman they want with impunity. Like, what are they going to do?
They're going to complain about it to Larry King and then be called liars because it's too convenient that somebody called in and then told their neighbors they must be lying. 4 people? 4 people confirm it? Impossible.
Exactly.
Impossible.
Like, literally, this is still happening. Person in power can basically do whatever the fuck he wants. Sometimes they get punished when it gets to be a little too inconvenient to ignore.
That's like a token thing.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a token thing. And
even then, like, wasn't it like fucking Epstein that like he already basically had charges, but then rich people kept showing up to his fucking house and hanging out with him after he was like a known rapist?
Yeah, basically.
It's fucking terrible, and they just don't care.
Yeah. And, you know, he points out that, you know, bourgeois people also just kind of tend to pass each other's wives around. So their own marriages are kind of a communal system because they, you know, seduce each other's wives and all of this. And, you know, I'm not a fucking bourgeois, so I don't know how fucking common this is now. But I imagine
Donald
it's
Trump
very
says
common.
He did it all the time.
Exactly.
And I think we can believe him. I know he's a compulsive liar. But I think when it comes to him talking about constantly moving on people over and over and over and over and over, it's fair to say that he's telling the truth.
Yeah, so Marx is pointing out that this shit is already in existence. So he says that the absolute worst that could be said of communists is that in place of this hypocritical and thinly concealed community of women, they would have an openly legalized one. But then again, it's also worth pointing out that with the abolition of an exploitative system, you would also have the abolition of the exploitation of women. So, you know, sex work would still exist, but it wouldn't be exploitative as it often is now.
Yeah, if you're going to do it, you do it for yourself. You don't do it because a pimp is forcing you to do it under threats of violence.
Exactly. Next, Marx talks about the fact that communists are accused of wanting to do away with countries and nationalities. And here he says, working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. So I think the point he's trying to make here is that because of the development of the world market and because of how ubiquitous working conditions are around the world, national differences between people are disappearing. But I think there's also a slight distinction to be made here in modern times, because I think the whole concept of nationality and patriotism has kind of been repackaged and sold back to us as a way of dividing people up more.
Well, and it's something that I think he kind of got wrong to begin with, because if you look at a lot of the left movements in South and Central America, those were successful because of nationalism, because of people trying to take back land that they thought should have been theirs, culture that should have been theirs. If you're Brazilian, you should have Brazilian culture. You shouldn't have the culture of the fucking Germans that fled Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing, like, while we should have a global humanity and we should have humanity as a race instead of Brazilian as a nationality, in the short term, it's absolutely necessary. And nationalism is a very important thing outside of white Europe. White Europe, it always seems to turn into, like, white ethno-state bullshit. But in other places, it's a really strong, important way of people fighting.
It's an anti-colonialism mindset,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah, and that's important to get away from the exploitation, even if it's just a step in the right direction. And, you know, I think if you are, say, a Cuban doctor who's going to Italy to help with the pandemic relief, and you see that people are paid so much more there, and you're getting this, basically, this fortune in reimbursement, you come back, you do it because you have pride in your culture, and pride in your people, and pride in where you came from, and your society, and what they've been doing, rather than just trying to do what's best for you necessarily now.
Yeah.
And while if you have a global communism, obviously there's no need for nations, because if you have nations, you're going to have uneven trade deals and things like that. That's probably not going to happen ever. So
Yeah.
because of that, pragmatically, I think it's an important thing.
Yeah, I agree. But I think the other thing is so Marx says that the unification of workers across countries is one of the first steps of emancipating the proletariat. But I think he has somewhat of a point there, because especially for people that are living in imperialistic countries, because we tend not to realize how much the lives that we are able to lead are reliant upon the exploitation of workers in other countries.
Yeah, I think something like the Foxconn factories are a good example of that sort of thing. People here, we have all sorts of worker standards. We have limitations on the amount of time that you're allowed to work, on how much you're allowed to be paid, whether you get overtime, the kinds of conditions you're allowed to work in, while Foxconn has nets around the building to stop people from killing themselves.
Yeah.
And I know that's been blown out of proportion, and that it's partially because people are doing suicide fraud for life insurance and things as part of the job. But if you're in a society where that's the situation, like, that's largely in part because American companies are hiring exploitative companies that don't pay you anything to do this. And when we have, Ivanka Trump doing t-shirt design in Indonesia with people where the entire factory makes less in a day than one of her dresses costs.
Yeah. Yeah, so in some ways it is very important to realize that our lives are interconnected with the workers in other countries, and that kind of worker solidarity, I think, is a good thing, as far as, raising awareness of what's going on, and allowing us to try to make better decisions as far as we can in the way that we do things.
When people bring up the fact that, like, American people now, the poorest in our country, are wealthier than, like, the wealthiest were 200 years ago, it's because we've now transferred the poorest to someplace else.
Yeah.
So while we still have lots of poverty here in relation to other people, and we have things that absolutely should be improved, the reason we don't have people living in cardboard shacks, showing up to work 80-hour work weeks, where if they're lucky they'll keep their hands after 20 years, is because we're doing that
Somewhere
to
else.
African nations or Asian nations. Yeah, it's still happening.
Yeah.
Just not where we see it.
Yeah. So lastly, as far as all these objections go, Marx basically says that, the very premise behind all of these objections that are being raised is fundamentally flawed. And he says that's because you can't really use the standard of bourgeois notions of freedom or culture or law when you talk about what communists intend to do. And I'm going to quote him here. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of your class made into law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. So basically, he's saying is that all of these norms that people are the bourgeois are freaking out about communism doing away with are just the product of the bourgeois class. They're not, these uh, set in stone natural laws. And he points out that each ruling class throughout history has had its own norms, and that each ruling class kind of tends to view these norms as like immutable and natural law instead of just being the conditions that allow their class to exist. So, he points out that with the disappearance of the ruling class, the old norms, yeah, they'll have to go, and a communist society will have new norms, and those will be created and shaped by the people for everybody's benefit.
And the resistance to that change is really readable now, where you see people readily visible now, where you see people saying things like, if we have change and I end up in a bread line, I'm gonna take your bread, because they can't stand the idea that other people should be elevated. They can't imagine people being elevated without them dropping.
Mm-hmm.
And the protection and normalization of these things that are going on now kind of shows up in politics, where we have things like identity politics, where Sanders is considered outlandish, and people will say things like, the Our Revolution PAC is giving money to white people over people of color running in the same districts, when the people of color, they're just conservative people that are running for the status quo. And people who are comfortable believe that something should change, progress needs to be made, but because they don't think that the status quo needs to change, then what we need to do is tokenism for change.
Mm-hmm.
It's vitally important that we have a woman for president, rather than vitally important that we have somebody that gives a shit about taking care of people. Because the way that things are is fine.
Yeah.
And it's vitally important that we have people of color in political parties, not to give us an alternative view, but for the sake of black skin. So Kamala Harris is a pretty fucking white lady. She's not, but she is. And Stacey Abrams says that her favorite book is Atlas Shrugged, because even though she's a Democrat, she's a fucking economic conservative person that buys into all this shit and buys into everything that goes along with the culture. And that's all part of protecting these norms.
Mm-hmm.
That we can't be flexible on this, but we can still pretend we're changing.
Yeah. Yeah, so Marx points out that people's ideas and cultures are fundamentally a product of their material conditions, and when those material conditions change, that results in the changing of ideas and cultures, and this has happened throughout time. And people might object that there's some things change throughout time, but there are things that have remained the same, such as concepts of property or philosophy or freedom and justice.
And that's such a bullshit thing, because historically, if there was a field, everybody owned it. You would go down, you would work the land, you would get food, and you would go home. And then some dick built a wall around it, and then you had to work for him.
Yeah. But even besides that, Marx says that the reason that there are some common elements that have persisted throughout history is because the common element of exploitation has also persisted throughout history. So yeah, there's going to be some common elements because exploitation is also a common element.
Yeah, and even in pre-capitalist societies, like feudalism was full of
Oh yeah.
exploitation
Yeah,
of people. It just
absolutely.
wasn't exploitation necessarily for profit, but like nobody really gave a shit about the lord of their area. And yes, they were protecting them, but they were only protecting them from other rich dicks that wanted to come in and take the land.
Yeah. So basically, a communist revolution is about the most radical departure that you can have from traditional values. And so obviously when that happens, there's going to be a radical change. But that doesn't mean it's bad.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've reached the end of the part where Marx covers objections, and the next part is basically him talking about how revolution is implemented, and that's a shorter part, but this is probably long enough for now, so we'll do that in another video.
Yep. That'll work. We'll see you guys then.